Section 1 is a kind of preface to the rest of the book. It's really intended just to say a little bit about why Hume wrote this book, or why Hume thinks this book is worthwhile, a little bit about what the book is trying to do, and a little bit of kind of description of the literature, the other kinds of literature that's related to this book, and precisely where this book falls in relation to that wider set of literature. So the wider set of literature is philosophy, but not all of philosophy. Actually, one of the two main branches, you could say, of philosophy at this time, which is moral philosophy. So by moral philosophy, Hume means something different than people mean today when they say moral philosophy. When people say moral philosophy today, they usually mean ethics, which is a specific branch of philosophy concerned with the difference between right and wrong, what the standards of that difference should be, and what we should do about particular moral or ethical dilemmas like abortion, euthanasia, and so on. And there are many topics in that contemporary discipline. But Hume means something actually broader than that. He means everything in philosophy that's not natural philosophy. Natural philosophy, you remember, was what people like Isaac Newton were doing. So trying to understand the natural world. Moral philosophy is trying to understand human beings, human behavior, human cognition. And it's kind of, the thought at the time is that there's a special there's a special way of thinking, a special kind of approach that's appropriate to questions in moral philosophy, which is different from questions in natural philosophy. One idea that's common is that it's harder to get as much precision in moral philosophy as it is in natural philosophy, because human beings are less regular in their behavior, or they're harder to study in some way. They're harder to study in terms of their the details of their regular patterns of behavior. So moral philosophy is basically everything having to do with human beings and with societies, okay, and with human minds, anything with human beings, roughly. The next big distinction that Hume makes, so Hume is basically saying this is a work of moral philosophy in section 1. But he makes a distinction between two kinds of moral philosophy, or two genres, we could say, of moral philosophy. Two ways of writing about topics in moral philosophy, two ways of thinking about topics in moral philosophy. And these he refers to by a number of different names, okay? But I'm just going to use two labels for them. I'm going to call one the easy philosophy, and the other the abstruse philosophy. Abstruse meaning difficult, harder to get a handle on, harder to make sense of, more abstract, more difficult to carry out, troublesome in some way. So the easy philosophy that Hume has in mind is something like what today we might call self-help books. Okay, these are kinds of books that are intended to inspire people. They're intended to help them see their interpersonal relationships in a different way, and maybe teach them something about what's the more effective way to carry out their business or to live the kind of life they want to live. So there's a lot of wisdom in these books, Hume thinks, but they don't do something that this other kind of philosophy does, the abstruse philosophy. The abstruse philosophy is more technical. It's more difficult to carry out. It's more difficult to read. It's not as much fun to read. But it does something different and important, Hume thinks, which is it actually gets as precise as possible, as it is able to get. It's trying to get precise about how human beings work. It's trying to get precise about how human cognition works, how the mind works, for instance. It's trying to get precise about whether or not we have good reason to believe in an external world, and what kind of external world we have good reason to believe. So when we start to ask philosophical questions and we start to say, man, it's getting pretty technical here. I mean, it looks like splitting hairs. It looks like some very refined work that's going on here, and I'm having a little bit of trouble following it. That's what Hume has in mind by the abstruse philosophy. And he kind of complains a little bit about the abstruse philosophy, or he echoes the complaints that other people can make of it. and says that, yeah, people can complain that it's very hard to read. It's not very inspiring to read. It's kind of feels kind of dull sometimes. Uh, Makes our head hurt trying to figure it out. But then he gives a number of arguments for the value of the abstruse philosophy. And I don't want to go over these in detail. You can find them in the chapter if you want. But they include things like it's hard to engage with things effectively if you don't actually understand how they really work. And so, like in many other fields, knowledge for its own sake, knowledge of the foundations, the fundamentals of something, often reveals to us new kinds of avenues of practical effectiveness that we wouldn't see if we only operated at the level of trying to solve individual problems or trying to solve practical problems. A parallel kind of paradox in the natural sciences is that it's often the fundamental research, not the research that's directed towards like a specific result, like curing a specific kind of cancer or coming up with a good treatment for a specific kind of cancer, but more very general research like I want to understand how DNA transcription works in cells, right? Not trying to get any particular medical benefit from it, but just trying to understand a basic mechanism of how cells work, for instance. That kind of basic research often nets enormous advances in medicine or in warfare or in other areas down the road. And so Hume is making a similar kind of argument here. He's saying even if you can't tell what the purpose of it is at the moment, you can't tell what the purpose of it is while you're doing the abstruse philosophy. When you then step back from it and you kind of have that fundamental knowledge that you've acquired by doing the abstruse philosophy, it actually does improve your ability. It can often improve one's ability to solve practical problems in practical contexts. So now that's just one of the arguments he gives for the value of the abstruse philosophy. He gives others as well in this chapter, and you're welcome to go and look at those in more detail if you like. And all of this, up to this point, is a kind of argument for the value of the inquiry itself, the book that this is the first section of, because the rest of the book is going to be trying to resolve issues in the abstruse philosophy. And Hume says as much in this section 1 near the end, that what he's going to do is try to actually resolve some of these issues. They've been very controversial. There's been a lot of discussion of them, but he wants to really, get down to the details, the really difficult, detailed stuff to be able to solve some problems. And so he's kind of begging the reader's patience to say, I'm going to get pretty technical, but it is for a good purpose. I think it's going to help us all understand things better. So bear with me, come along for the ride and let's try to figure this out.